Now, it's an obvious statement that music can enhance the experience that you might have when watching a movie, a show, or when playing a video game. It can both immerse the viewers into the story being told, and it can also help in telling those stories through music. While primarily these forms of media are driven and progressed by the main elements of characters and the stories that are usually told verbally, the music can also be a very important element and can be a character in itself, capable of telling just as much of the story that words can. As expected, the music should reflect the mood that the story has set, and vice versa. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, I think, is a perfect example of storytelling done through music, and also in immersiveness through compositional decisions. Now, in comparison to previous entries in the Legend of Zelda series, they all give off different feelings and different vibes. Sometimes the soundtracks for their majority can be upbeat and heroic, like Ocarina of Time and Link to the Past. And sometimes they can be mysterious and dreary, like Twilight Princess or Majora's Mask. Now, Breath of the Wild's soundtrack is a bit of a black sheep when you compare it to the rest of the series. It subverted the expectations of fans and challenged the question of what a Zelda game should sound like. If there are one or two words that you could use to describe its music and the general sound of the game, the two most fitting words would be quiet and somber. Breath of the Wild fully leans into its setting through its soundtrack, or rather sometimes the lack of it for a lot of the time. The game starts off with Link waking up and discovering a ruined and post-apocalyptic world, provoking a ghost-like feeling of a land that once was. In the story, the Kingdom of Hyrule was destroyed 100 years ago because of Link's failure to stop the destruction caused by Calamity Ganon. The soundtrack reflects this and chooses for the most part when you're out in the open to simply have the ambient sounds of nature around the player, and to only have small hints of music every once in a while, with seconds of silence in between. It gives you a sense of isolation, and it's very effective in pushing the narrative of the story. The music taps into this broken version of Hyrule by sounding broken itself. When people had first started playing the game around the time of its release, there were high expectations set by the series as a whole, and the story trailer released 2 months prior to the game's release only set those expectations higher. It definitely came as a bit of a surprise to have this much openness in the soundtrack, as opposed to the commonality of having something like an overworld theme constantly playing. With this new style of music that hadn't yet been seen before in a Zelda game, it came with a lot of mixed reception from the fans. Usually with the Legend of Zelda franchise, the music is adventurous and epic. Breath of the Wild wasn't even close to being as adventurous in its soundtrack as previous games had been. This isn't to say, of course, that the entire soundtrack is this ambient. It does have its fair share of grandiose and orchestral scores, just not to the same capacity as the past. The music can range from the calmness of Hyrule Field's theme to the epicness and intense theme of the Divine Beast battles. Now, the majority of the time spent when playing the game will most likely have the player wandering and exploring the incredibly vast and open kingdom of Hyrule. And since exploration is such a big part of the game's experience, it would probably get repetitive after a certain point if you were to listen to the same music track for such an extended period. I think that the use of silence and ambient noise within Breath of the Wild's soundtrack works because of how open and gigantic the game is, so it should only make sense that the music should be as open as its setting. Its use of minimal background music when exploring the vastness of Hyrule prevents the songs that do show up from becoming annoying and repetitive. And because of how sparingly placed it is, it leaves a much more lasting impression on the players. As I mentioned earlier, I brought up that much of the world has this ghost-like feeling, showing sometimes only remnants of what used to be. And with the mention of only having hints of music in certain areas, a prime example of this can be seen very close to the beginning of the game. One of the first big landmarks that can be seen at the start of your adventure is the Temple of Time, or rather, an extremely run-down version of it. Once the player gets close enough to it, you'll begin to hear some of those spaced-out notes I mentioned earlier, coming from a lone and subdued piano. If you listen closely once you're inside and around the temple, and or if you were to speed up the music, you can hear a very bare-bones motif of the original Temple of Time theme from an earlier Zelda game, Ocarina of Time. Here's the original composition. And now here's a sped-up version of the rendition heard in Breath of the Wild. Now, this is just one of the many times that Nintendo has used nostalgia as a factor within Breath of the Wild's soundtrack. Nostalgia is something that Nintendo is best known for using as an element within their soundtracks, especially in the Zelda series. Many iconic and classic themes from past games can be heard throughout many of the tracks in the game. Just as the Temple of Time theme pays tribute to Ocarina of Time, two more tracks that also pay tribute to that game are the themes heard in Goron City and in Zora's Domain. There's also a tribute to a fan-favorite game heard in the Rito Village theme. It starts off sounding like a completely new track, and as the music begins to swell up, leading to the main melody, a familiar tune is heard instead. If you haven't figured it out, this is the exact same melody heard in Dragon Roost Island from The Wind Waker. However, the soundtrack isn't just effective because it sometimes brings back familiar motifs. The reason that the use of these tunes works is because of the restraint that's shown throughout Breath of the Wild's music. It balances nicely with the new compositions made for the game. They hold back until just the right moments to throw those nostalgic punches. Sometimes they're heard as full-on covers, like the three examples I had just mentioned, and other times they take a back seat in the music, like the Temple of Time's music. Another subtle homage to an old Zelda tune is the Death Mountain theme. Now, one of my favorite songs to hear when venturing through Hyrule is the horseback riding theme. A subdued piano riff fades in once you ride for long enough without any interruptions from things like enemies or being within a town. The way that it's arranged emulates a similar feeling to that of a horse galloping. It feels very carefree, just like a horse out in the wild. And if you ride for even more time, a violin begins to fade in, and if you listen closely, you can hear a slower version of the main Zelda theme when riding at night. And in the day, you'll hear the strings play Zelda's lullaby. Hearing the two most iconic and recognizable themes from the franchise with such a new and melancholic undertone really reminds you that Breath of the Wild is a much different experience from previous entries, and it makes these themes feel both familiar and refreshing. One key element that I've been bringing up in regard to the soundtrack is the openness in the music. This openness, paired with the ambient sound design of the world, really pulls you into the world of Hyrule and immerses you in a way that previous games in the series just haven't been able to accomplish, at least to this extent. The silence, of course, doesn't always last forever. Musical cues are a common thing in video games, but the way that some of these cues creep in from the silence of the wilderness, they can either provide a sense of relaxation, alert you to nearby danger, or inform you of nearby towers or shrines. I discovered upon looking through the soundtrack that there's a different theme that plays when you're close to a shrine depending on what region of the map you're in. More often than not while exploring, especially at night, there's a good chance that you'll run into a couple of enemies along the way. These musical cues vary on the type of enemies you run into. If you come across a small group of bokoblins or lizals, you hear the battle theme subtly enter from the quiet. Usually you wouldn't have to worry too much if you start hearing this, as these types of enemies don't pose a huge threat. Just a nice reminder to stay on your toes. On the contrary though, if you start hearing this, it's a pretty good signal to start running. Guardians are some of the stronger and more dangerous enemies, and the musical cue when you're targeted by one is so effective because of the sudden transition from a quiet and relaxed state to one of fear. Now, obviously, not all of the music in the game is meant to alert you to danger. Much of the music can provoke the complete opposite effect, one of comfort that can put you at ease from the uncertainty of the wild. Sometimes you might find yourself lost through your exploration, but then you might hear the faint music coming from a nearby stable, and it makes you feel welcome and at home. The same can be said for the music of the many towns and villages throughout Hyrule. Unlike the sparse and unpredictable piano of the wilderness, the town themes are full and melodic, and they provide these safe havens where you can take a breath between the action. Each town has its own unique musical composition that gives every town you visit their own unique personalities. Many of them are focused more on solo performances or small ensembles, instead of something like a big orchestra. It all sounds very human because of the fact that many of these pieces were recorded live. If you listen closely, you can even hear the players taking a breath occasionally, and it really makes the game feel so much more alive and intimate. The town themes are so heartwarming because of how it contradicts the silence and ambience that is heard for a majority of the time. But one of the most heartwarming of the town themes, and one that actually pushes the thematic narrative of the story, is Tarrey Town. Now, at the start of the side quest revolving around Tarrey Town, there isn't much of a town to begin with. You meet a villager named Hudson, who is from Hateno Village, and he's trying to build and populate a new village from the ground up. To help him with these tasks, you need to gather lots and lots of wood, and find people all across the kingdom who are unhappy with where they're at in life, and are looking for a fresh start. When you first arrive in Tarrey Town, the music sounds like this at first. It's quiet, and feels a little lonely with only the piano in the background accompanying the main melody. But it also gives a slight feeling of potential that is yet to come to the town. As you progress through this side quest and invite more and more people to Tarrey Town, the music begins to change and fill up with more instruments. When you first introduce the Goron into the town, this trombone and marimba are added to the music. When the Gerudo joins the village, the music gains a sitar. whole new section is added with the Rito, bringing in some wind instruments. And lastly is the addition of a subtle guitar from the Zora. Each of these motifs comes from the hometown that each of these races were originally from. This slow addition of each new melody when new people come to Tarrytown is a great way of really evoking the feeling of this town being built from the ground up. And when they all come together, the end result sounds so full of life and joy. It's this lively blend of all these different cultures that represents this glimmer of hope that still exists in this post-apocalyptic world. Tarrytown is really a symbol of hope in this post-apocalyptic version of Hyrule, showing that there's always a future to look forward to, and that despite the course that history had set sail on, Hyrule can start anew and live on. However, on the opposite end of this spectrum in terms of the piece, there's the war that was waged and the very thing that caused the disruption of the peace in the first place, the Great Calamity Ganon. Stopping Ganon and restoring peace to Hyrule is the main end goal of the game, and the journey that you go on trying to fulfill that quest pays off when you come to the decision to face Ganon in the depths of Hyrule Castle. This is what everything has been leading up to and building towards. This music, played in what is considered to be the game's final dungeon, is a fan favorite among the community, and something that makes it all the more fulfilling for the fans are that 3 different leitmotifs can be heard throughout the theme. You could argue that each of these represents the 3 wielders of the Triforce. The first leitmotif is the main Zelda theme, which represents our main hero, Link. Then there's Zelda's Lullaby, which obviously represents Princess Zelda. And finally, there is the organ of Ganon's Tower, representing Calamity Ganon. Hearing all of these together in one theme is an amazing treat for the ears that really just makes your adventure feel worthwhile. Now, technically, you can head straight to the castle to fight Ganon almost as soon as you start the game, but that's not what the game is about. Link is weak and has very minimal equipment at the start, and you'd essentially be digging your own grave by going to Hyrule Castle right away. Breath of the Wild definitely falls into the category of being more about the journey rather than the destination. At the core of what I've been talking about this whole time, this game truly reflects every aspect of the story within the soundtrack. You start off alone and are unfamiliar with the broken world lying ahead of you. As you get stronger and come to more intense story beats, the music follows suit with those moments. And when the game finally comes to the climax, it's at its strongest and most orchestral, and works so well. Breath of the Wild's soundtrack may not be universally loved by all fans, but there's no denying that it does an absolutely amazing job of solidifying the game's setting, and that it masterfully helps push the narrative of the story. It's one of, if not the most immersive soundtrack throughout the entire Zelda franchise, and it's for those reasons that it is my personal favorite, and that it's one of the best. It's safe to say that Nintendo will probably take a similar approach towards the soundtrack for the sequel to Breath of the Wild, and I personally am all in for more music like this in the Zelda series. If you haven't played Breath of the Wild yet, I highly recommend that you do, because it's such an amazing game that's definitely worth buying. I don't think that me just talking about the game and listening to the music alone does the game justice. The fact that it won the Game of the Year award I think is really a testament to how great the game truly is. To me and many other people, Breath of the Wild isn't just a video game. It's an experience, and I think that it's an experience that you would really get the best out of by playing the game firsthand. So if you have the chance, go and experience it for yourself. Thanks for watching, and have an amazing day.